I'm pleased to welcome Kim Nelson. Kim is a research wildlife biologist in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University and co-principal investigator with the Oregon Marbled Murrelet Project. She has spent decades researching the ecology and habitat associations of seabirds like the marbled murrelet, and then working to connect her studies with management implications. She's published more than 50 scientific papers on her research, and she is here to give us the rundown on what she's learned about these super cool birds. So after Kim's presentation, I'll spend a few minutes talking about Oregon Wild's work, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So again, you can enter your questions at any time in the Q&A bubble on the interface, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Kim to do that. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Chandra. I appreciate your introduction, and thanks to everybody who is here today. I'm going to start my to share my screen and bring up my presentation. Working? Okay, great. So I did change the title of the talk to add seabird of the forest and the ocean because they do occur in two major ecosystems, but I will be talking about the life and times of the marbled murrelet. Marbled murrelets are a very cool seabird, which I'm going to let you know about their biology today and some of the research findings that we have. But they occur in the Eastern Pacific from the Aleutian Islands down to Central California during the breeding season, and they're found as far south as northern Baja, Mexico during the wintertime. There are lots of names for marbled murrelets. Australian bumblebee, probably because of how fast they fly. I'm going to talk about that. And fog larks and fog birds, because they're in the Oregon coast anyway, we have a lot of fog, and often you hear the birds calling, but you don't see them. And they're very cryptic and secretive. And the Native Americans had a lot of other names for them as well. So what I'm going to focus on today is what makes marbled murrelets so cool, and then talk about some of our research on the Oregon Marbled Murrelet Project. How do we find their nests, and what are we learning from our project so far? Marbled murrelets are in the auk family, so they're related to puffins, common murres, pigeon guillemots, rhinoceros auklets, and others. The thing that makes them different is that they nest in small groups rather than colonially, and they nest in trees and on the ground, inland rather than colonially in coastal and offshore rocky areas. And today I'm going to focus on the southern portion of their range, primarily Washington, Oregon, and California, where they nest primarily in trees, actually mostly in trees. There's only one nest known in Washington from a cliff. But in the northern portion of their range, they nest both on the ground and in trees. The marbled murrelet was the last North American bird species to have its nest found. The first, at the time, the first nest found that everybody thought was in 1974. And this is a paper published in the Wilson Bulletin on that first nest. Since there's been some research since then to show that there were a few other nests found earlier than 1974, but it's the one that everyone refers to. And here I want to give a shout out to the Native Americans, because once we started talking to them, we found out that they already knew through their traditional ecological knowledge that marbled murrelets nested in inland forests. And the ornithologists and naturalists in the 30s and 40s did not interact with them, and so didn't ask them where marbled murrelets nest. So there was 100 years or more of people searching for marbled murrelet nests and not knowing where they nested. All we had to do was ask the Native Americans. So marbled murrelets are in the genus Brachyramphus. They have a unique plumage in the different seasons. In the breeding season, they're in this very cryptic plumage you see on the left-hand side. And during the non-breeding season, they molt into this black and white plumage, which is more similar to common murres and some of the other seabirds. They're fast flyers. They're small, and so they have high wing loading, but they can fly 60 to 70 miles per hour as they commute from their ocean feeding habitat inland to their nesting sites. They're a long-lived seabird, 10 to 15 years. We hope that's a minimum and that they live longer than that, but we don't know for sure. And they feed on small fish and invertebrates. They're pretty much generalists. They'll feed their chicks only this fish, but the adults will eat invertebrates during the fall and winter time. So where do you find marbled murrelets? Well, their marine habitat is just offshore. They forage close to the shore in relatively shallow water. You can see them out beyond the breakers. And they sit on the water, but then dive underneath the water and fly underwater with their wings to catch small schooling fish. On the right-hand side, I show a graph from Craig Strong and his research showing that the densities on the Oregon coast are highest in the central part of the coast off of the Siuslaw National Forest. So the length of those blue bars indicates the density of the birds. So you can see they do occur all along the coast, but the highest densities are on the central coast. So what's their breeding habitat? Well, they fly into older age forests up to 50 miles from the coast. The farthest inland nest site that we know of in Oregon to date is at about 31 miles, but they do nest farther inland. We have detections, just haven't found the nest yet. They also nest in younger forests, about 60 years or older, that have remnant trees. So if the past fire went through or there was thinning in the past and trees were left behind and allowed to grow, and then the forest grew back up around those remnant trees, then we have murrelets nesting in that kind of habitat. And here in Oregon, we have a unique habitat in the Sitka spruce western hemlock forest close to the coast, where there's dwarf mistletoe. And it's not the kind of mistletoe you're thinking of at Christmas time, but it infects the limb and makes the branch larger. And I'll show you some pictures of what murrelet nests look like, but it makes branches larger on younger trees than they would otherwise without the mistletoe. And as I'll get into later when I talk about some of the threats to the species, larger stands provide more interior forest and protection from the elements and predators. The types of trees they nest in, they're in large trees with large limbs. Most of the nests are in conifer trees, so of all different species, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, you name it, they'll use them if they're available inland. They occasionally use deciduous trees, so now we have about 4 nests known from alder and big leaf maple, and 2 of the big leaf maple nests are from Oregon and the Oregon Marbled Murrelet Project. And so the picture on the right is one of our maple nests we found, and you can barely see the breeding adult hidden on that large branch in the maple inside that red circle. So murrelets don't build a nest, and that's why they need a large limb. And they'll nest next to the trunk or at a fork away from a trunk, any place where there's a large, relatively flat limb that has some kind of substrate on it. They'll nest on moss, they'll nest on duff. An interesting thing that we learned by climbing these nest trees years after the nest was there, that the landing pads stay evident. So you have a bird flying in 60 miles an hour, it has to stall out, usually come from below, and they land pretty hard on the nest branch. And that creates those areas, that bare areas that you see in the figure on the right on either side of the fecal ring. So that fecal ring is created by the chick being on the nest for 30 to 40 days. It just defecates in a ring around the nest. And we can recognize these nests years later because of the landing pad and the little nest cup that's left, even though the fecal matter will be gone. So the nest on the left was found because there is a little depression, which you can barely see, and there's a really evident landing pad. The more they use the nest, the more obvious the landing pads and nest cups are. And they do have site fidelity. They'll come back to the same stands year after year, but they don't always use the same nest tree or nest limbs. So they'll nest on different limbs in the same tree or different trees within the same stand. So what's the timing of all of this? They nest between April and September. They lay only a single egg, which they incubate for about 4 weeks. And both adults incubate, changing places every 24 hours. So one bird is out on the ocean for 24 hours, and the other bird is on the nest for 24 hours. Once the chick hatches, it's brooded for 1 to 2 days after hatching. And then the adults leave it alone on the nest, and they come back to feed the chick 1 to 4 times a day, sometimes up to 9. And I did want to show on the right-hand side the 2 different pictures. There's the one of the chick on the nest above that looks black and white. It's the winter plumage of the marbled murrelet. But the chicks keep their downy feathers on until right before they're going to fledge. And so the bottom picture is a chick that fell out of the nest, of which we rescued. But you can see it still has the downy plumage, but it's just starting to lose it on its head. It will pluck off that down within 12 to 24 hours before it leaves the nest to fly to the ocean, because they're much more cryptic with that downy plumage on. If they were to not have that, they'd be much more visible to predators. I'm going to show you a series of videos here. This is one of a parental exchange. So this is from one of our nest cameras on our project. You can see here, they exchange places at dawn. So this is a dark infrared. You can see the eye. The one bird had been sitting on the egg, incubating the egg for 24 hours. Its mate just arrived from the ocean, and it was on the ocean for 24 hours. And now they're changing places at dawn. And this is why we do our surveys at dawn, because we can see this exchange happening. I mentioned that they just brood the chick for 1 day. So we were able to catch that on video. You can just see the chick barely sticking its head out from underneath the adult there. They'll only stay with the chick for 1 to 2 days, and then they leave it alone on the nest. And they come back and feed the chick. So the adults have to make trips back and forth, and they bring a whole fish. So it's given the chick a whole fish, which the chick will swallow whole and head first, and then wait there until the next meal. And sometimes it's sticking out for a while because it takes a while to digest the big fish that they're fed by the adults. So unfortunately, marbled murrelets are listed as threatened in Washington, Oregon, and California, and they're also listed as threatened in British Columbia. At the state level, they're listed as endangered in Washington, Oregon, and California because of a variety of threats. One of the threats are nest predators. These are corvids, the family of corvids. Common ravens and Steller's jays have been documented to depredate murrelet nests. They'll eat the eggs or the chick. Crows and gray jays are likely predators. Many nests fail every year because of nest predation. There's also the loss of and fragmentation of older forests. On the left are 2 maps, one from the 1930s and the other from 2012. The green color is the old growth forest. So you can see that in 1930s, there was quite a bit of old growth throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. But by 2012, most of it, or more than 90% of it, was gone. And since 2012, even more habitat has been lost. In the paper cited there at the bottom, Valente et al., we found a 20% loss in murrelet habitat and a 17% increase in fragmentation since 1988. The bird was listed in 1992. So there's been habitat loss and fragmentation, even though the murrelet has been listed since 92. There are also threats at sea, and they have to do with prey availability. They have to have those small forage fish of the right size close to shore so that they can catch those fish and take them back to their nest. The oceans are changing, and with climate change, they're changing faster. There's a picture on the bottom of what happened in 2014 and 2019. The dark red color means really hot ocean. And when there isn't cool ocean, you don't get the upwelling, which brings the prey to the surface. And it also changes the phytoplankton, zooplankton, and the whole food chain. So a lot of impacts have happened, and it's happening more frequently. And this year, we even have some warm water off of California and into southern part of Oregon. So this is important because murrelets have a split habitat strategy. And most seabirds have this strategy where they nest in one place and they forage in another, and those areas are spatially distant from one another. This makes them very sensitive to changes in either habitat. And a point I want to make, because some people will pick on one thing and say it's the forest, and somebody else will say it's the ocean. It's both. They need both the forest and the ocean to survive. It's not one or the other. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing on the Marbled Murrelet project, which started in 2016 and ended in 2022. There was money that came from the Oregon legislature to the College of Forestry, and then they cooperated with Dan Roby and I in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences. So the 4 PIs are Jim Rivers, myself, Matt Betts, and Dan Roby, and we've been studying space use, breeding habitat, and behavior of murrelets in Oregon. So how do we find nests? We did it by going out on OSU's research vessel, the Pacific Storm, and we would go out at night, stay out all night, and then come back in the morning. We would launch a Zodiac in the dark from the boat with 3 people in it, one driving the boat, one with a headlamp, and the person at the front with a net. You don't see the net in this picture, but it's a big fishing net that somebody might use to scoop up the fish that they have on the end of their line. And the murrelets freeze in the light if we're lucky, and the person in the front can reach out and grab them. If they're not lucky, then they have to circle around and try and catch birds. If they dive, they can shine the light down in the water, and the murrelet will sometimes come up right into the light, and they can scoop it up in the net. The birds are then transported back to our big vessel where we take morphometrics on them. So we measure them, weigh them, and we take blood. Because the sexes are, plumage is the same, we don't know males from females, so we need the blood to determine sex. But we've also been looking at hormone levels, blood parasites, and stable isotopes for diet. And those are things I won't talk about today because that research is still ongoing. And then we put a VHF tag on the bird. It weighs, it's a very light tag that doesn't impact the birds in terms of the rules of how heavy a tag you can put on a bird. And it is old technology. The satellite tags are too large for the murrelet and have an impact on their survival. So we're still using the small VHF tags. Because of that, we have to track them with receivers and antennas. And so we had a coastal telemetry team that was out there all along the coast, trying to find out where the murrelets were on the water. If we couldn't find them on the water, we'd get up in a plane, and we also used the plane to track the birds inland to find out where they were nesting. Once we found a nest, we would put up a camera in an adjacent tree and document 24/7 the activity at the nest site. One of our graduate students is working on this. He's going to be describing the nest site characteristics of murrelets and looking into their behavior. We have another graduate student who's working on the diet and looking at all the prey that were brought in by the adults that were captured on the camera. This is an example of how well our cameras work from an adjacent tree. This is just zooming in from the adjacent tree to the nest site. And we kept it zoomed in so that we could see what was happening at the nest. So what are we learning? I'm going to start with a couple of videos that show movement of the bird and of the birds that we captured and put a tag on. So the first one's going to be local movement. So this is one bird in in May, and its movements to go forage. So you can see the little white line is that bird moving up and down within our study area on a day-to-day basis between the 27th of May and July 31st. There are also broad scale movements that these birds made. In 2017, because of poor ocean conditions, we had no birds go inland to nest. There was just no prey available for them in the near shore. So many of our birds went to Washington or California in search of prey. Those birds returned in subsequent years. So they are Oregon, they have fidelity to Oregon and their nesting sites, but they do move and may not breed in a given year depending on the ocean conditions. So here, this is our capture study area where we captured the birds. And this shows a variety of birds and their movements between May and July. You can see some of them going way up to Washington, and we had birds going all the way down to San Francisco Bay in California, and maybe farther south, because that's as far south as we flew. So this has implications for the population monitoring, because the coast is divided up into these zones 1 through 5, and not every zone is surveyed every year. So in 2017, as an example, we tagged our birds in zone 3, but many of them moved into zone 4 where they were doing surveys that year. So they counted Oregon birds as California birds or Southern Oregon birds, when really they are Central Oregon breeders. So that it might be having an impact on our population estimates of the birds. So the within season movements and ocean conditions have an effect on prey availability, which affects their breeding propensity. Are they going to breed in a given year, and are they going to fly inland? We might not detect a bird at an inland site because it's not breeding in that particular year, but it doesn't mean that site's not an occupied site or a nesting site. They're just missing because they're not breeding in that particular year. The prey availability affects their distribution during the breeding season. So birds might be counted in California or on California or Washington surveys when really they're Oregon birds. So what about the nests? Between 2017 and 2022, we found 37 nests. That adds to the 78 nests that were found by myself and some of the agency folks. So now we have 115 nests known in Oregon. But during this study, we learned that the birds have a very low breeding frequency. Only 12% of the birds nested that we tagged. You know, why is that? Is it poor ocean conditions? Are there tag effects? Are there other things that are affecting whether they breed? We know that ocean conditions are affecting them, but we really don't know the other reasons. These results match other studies where they put tags on birds in Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska in terms of the low breeding propensity. So this shows a distribution of our 37 active nests that we found in 2018, 19, and 21. In 2017, I mentioned that they did no birds nested, so we had no nests. And in 2020, we had to cancel our field season because of COVID. All of the birds nested, near our study area. We captured the birds between, Newport and down to Yachats. 35 of the nests were on Forest Service land, 1 was on BLM land, and 1 was on private. Not all the nests are successful, and that seems to be the case in all studies that have been done on murrelets, whether it was using tags or not. A lot of my early work was done just by observing birds and finding the nests by watching them fly into the forest, and even a lot of those nests were successful. So, even a lot of those nests failed and very few were successful. Overall, about 70 to 80% of the nests fail every year, which is not good for populations increasing. So in our study, we had 15 successful nests and 22 that failed, for a success rate of 41%. I'm going to show you one of the predation events that happened at our nest, which was a surprise to us because it was a new species. Oops, sorry. Got to go back here. it was a red-tailed hawk that came in to take a chick, and that had not been documented before. The year after this, we documented another red-tailed hawk taking one of our chicks. So the question that we want to ask is it because more occupied sites are near the edges than previously because of fragmentation, and red-tailed hawks are moving into the area and learning that marbled murrelets make a good meal. We're not sure whether they were just overlooked as a predator earlier on. I want to put a plug in for an event that's coming up on July 18th and 19th. Portland Audubon every year has this event where there are marbled murrelet surveys done at Cape Perpetua and so 5 places total along the coast. So folks can come over and join us there, or at least for the evening presentation, they can join virtually. 6:30 p.m. on the July 18th, and then on July 19th, we all go out to the 5 different places and actually do a murrelet surveys. You get to see how the surveys are done. You get to see the murrelets fly into the forest. If you haven't done so, it's a great experience. No training is needed. You'll be informed of everything while you're there. To sign up, you need to go to Portland Audubon and look at their events page. And they want you to sign up so that they can send you information about where to, if you need camping or places to stay in Yachats, a lot of information about the event and the surveys. So I want to thank everybody who helped with the research in this project. And with that, I can take any questions.
All right, thanks, Kim. And actually, before we get to questions, I'm going to take over for a moment, but you can put questions that you have for Kim in the Q&A, and we will get there very soon.
So I stopped sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so, thank you so much. That was a great summary of, I'm sure, a lot more research that you could have shared.
Yeah.
Really fascinating critters. So, and I will put in a double plug there for getting involved with the volunteer effort to monitor, to survey for murrelets. I did it once a number of years ago, and it was really cool. I did get to see one bird flying overhead in the dusk light or the dawn light, so it was pretty cool. All right, let me share my screen here for a minute. All right. Well, again, I might have forgotten to introduce myself earlier, but I'm Chandra Lukwe with Oregon Wild in our Eugene office. I've spent a lot of time in the Coast Range in some of this murrelet habitat, so it's always fascinating to learn a little bit more. For anyone who's not familiar with Oregon Wild, we are a nonprofit organization founded in 1974 with offices and staff around the state. Our mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters, which means that we've been advocating for protecting habitats, including wilderness and roadless areas, wild and scenic rivers, and our last remaining old growth forests, mostly on federal public lands. That our work also means that we have been advocating for strong protections for native wildlife species, including those on the endangered species list, from spotted owls to coho salmon to marbled murrelets, and have celebrated and worked on policy to support the return of species like wolves, condors, and sea otters. And I want to mention sea otters in part because they live in the nearshore environment, just like marbled murrelets. And the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife just wrapped up a series of open houses along the coast about the feasibility of sea otter reintroduction, something that we're following really closely. So I'm not sure if any of you out there were able to attend those, but there's more to come on sea otter reintroduction, and Oregon Wild has some previous webcasts that you can find on our YouTube channel, and also a podcast that you can find on our website about sea otters. So of course, ensuring that all of these critters have quality habitat is really important. They need places to nest and feed and raise their young and disperse to new territories. And so a lot of our work has gone into doing just that. And from our murrelets, most of that habitat is on federal public lands. Kim, you mentioned that most of the nests that you were surveying for recently were found on the Salmon National Forest. And that tracks. But because murrelets do fly inland so far, they make it to lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So on this public lands map, you can see the light green is Forest Service, and there's a bunch on the Central Coast. The sort of peach color is Bureau of Land Management. So there's a bunch in the Coast Range, just inside the range of the marble murrelet. And then there's also state forest lands, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that are in yellow. And the habitat for murrelets still exists in the Coast Range on these public lands, in part because groups like Oregon Wild have worked for decades to protect the last remaining mature and old growth forests on these public lands, as well as ensuring protections for rivers and streams. So over the years, we've worked to use laws like the Wilderness Act to protect intact forests, and I'll get to another map in just a minute. But by the time the Wilderness Act and other laws that we use to protect habitat got into place, including the Endangered Species Act, a lot of logging and road building had already happened across the Coast Range from the 1950s through the 80s. So due to that extensive history of industrial logging practices on both private and public lands, there's just not a lot of in the murrelet's historic range. So on this map, intact forests are forests that we're calling 1,000 acres or larger in size that have not been logged. And in the Coast Range, there's not very much of that. And you can see that one of the big reasons is because of the ongoing clear cutting, and in the animation, that's mostly private land where you can see the little clear cuts popping up, but it's also showing the Elliott State Forest. I think you can see my cursor. I'm circling where the Elliott State Forest is. So until 2019, we had only been successful in designating about 23,000 acres of wilderness, the gold standard of protections for public lands, within the Salmon National Forest here on the Central Coast. And that's split between three areas, Drift Creek, Cummins Creek, and Rock Creek, which show up in these intact forest areas here on the map. But a lot of other areas were fragmented into small patches. And that's in large part because of corporate ownership of the Coast Range. And this map's from the Coast Range Association. It kind of flips what's highlighted. The other map was showing more public lands. The red and the purple on this map is showing corporate ownership of the Coast Range. And so that's where, this extensive clear cutting is still ongoing today. So here's a zoom in of that intact forest map of showing just the coast, and you can see here's Drift Creek, and here's Cummins Creek and Rock Creek wilderness areas. But then some of the fragmentation of the old growth habitat. I don't have a legend on this map, but the dark green is the oldest forest, and the lighter blue is kind of maturing forests. And so you can see some of the tiny patches that are left in this area, right where Kim was doing some of her research and tagging. Here's from Newport down to Yachats. But wilderness protection actually doubled in 2019 with the passage of the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which actually, let me go back 1 second, which is this really large intact looking area on this map. The biggest one, in fact, in the Central Oregon Coast Range, outside of the Kalmiopsis area down to the south. So the Devil's Staircase Wilderness is about 26,000 acres of unlogged forests with amazing pristine creeks and old growth forests, and is fantastic murrelet habitat, although it's be really hard to survey in there because it's very steep and hard to access. I'm not sure if there's been studies done in there or not, but it's a spectacular place, and we're really excited to work. I was really excited to work for 10 years myself on getting that passed. This additional amazing intact forest wilderness in the Coast Range now. And one of the other ways of protecting forests and water and habitat is through protecting more rivers and streams under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So probably folks know about the River Democracy Act, which was introduced in 2021 by Senator Ron Wyden. And it would protect thousands of miles of pristine waterways across the state, including some on the coast. That includes a buffer of a ½ mile on each side of the stream. So that means a lot of habitat and potentially old forests where murrelets can and other species can find refuge. And we're really hoping that Senator Wyden reintroduces this bill very soon so that we can move forward with protecting these streams and all this habitat. The bill for the Coast Range in the area we're talking about tonight includes Kentucky Creek. This is a picture of Kentucky Falls, one of my favorite places, as well as Gwynn Creek, which is covered in amazing, beautiful old growth forests and murrelet habitat, and sits just north of the Cummins Creek Wilderness. So our oldest and unlogged forests are incredibly important, from keeping water cool and clean for salmon to providing the nesting structures that things like murrelets need, to, of course, soaking up and storing carbon from the atmosphere in their trunks and soil. But unfortunately, there's still logging planned in some of these last remaining forests, including on public lands. This is a picture of a beautiful old stand that I visited on BLM land south of Eugene that is slated for harvest. But Oregon Wild is part of an effort to ask the Biden administration and federal agencies to enact a durable national rule to protect these forests, all mature and old growth forests on public lands across the country, for lots of reasons, but most importantly right now for the role that they can play in battling the climate crisis as a natural solution. So right now, the federal agencies, the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, are asking for public comments on these proposed rules that would better conserve our forests and public lands. Their periods are open until July 5th for the BLM and July 20th for the Forest Service, and you can weigh in on those at this handy dandy website. We really hope that you do. We hear that support for this rule has topped out at over 2 million comments at this point, but we still need more voices to speak up for these forests and these durable rules. So if you haven't already done that, please do so. All right, in addition to protecting our current old growth forests on federal public lands, one way to benefit murrelets and the biodiversity and climate values of public forests is through restoration. And on the Siuslaw National Forest, the area that we're focused on tonight, there are tens of thousands of acres of old clear cuts that have regrown into uniform plantations, and they can be thinned, taking out some of the trees to increase diversity and habitat structures, while also creating timber and jobs, as long as it's done carefully. So we've long been a proponent of this where it's done right, but the most important thing is that it's done based on scientists and wildlife biologists like Kim's research, so that we aren't inadvertently harming threatened species while these new forests are maturing into high quality habitat. But in theory, that's what can happen, is that these forests will grow up and become amazing habitat in the future. Another opportunity for murrelet habitat is on state forest lands. So I brought back that little snippet of a map that shows where the yellow lands that are state lands in the Coast Range where murrelets could live. And there is some remaining habitat in these state forest lands, including the Elliott State Forest, which is now becoming a research forest for Oregon State University, and some in the Tillamook and Clatsop forests on the north coast. There's other scattered parcels of state lands that you can see have some intact habitat, in fact. And it's important that the habitat on state lands has as much protection as possible, because they could become future murrelet habitat. So Oregon Wild worked starting in 2016 to uplist the marbled murrelet under the State Endangered Species Act to endangered, which once it was finally codified, ensured the creation of an endangered species recovery plan and survival guidelines for murrelets for all state lands. So we're excited to see where that goes, and Kim's research is contributing to that. So with that, I will stop and say thanks for listening, and I will get to the questions. All right, I'm going to just, I'll kind of survey them as we go here, but the first question from way back was about bioacoustic monitoring, whether that's taking place, and if so, if there's a way for volunteers to be involved.
There is some projects through the College of Forestry. They're doing a big project on spotted owls, and they're picking up marbled murrelets on the recordings while they're doing that work. There is also a graduate student over in the College of Forestry who is looking to see if we might be able to use acoustic monitoring to determine the behavior of the birds. Because you can record murrelets and you hear them calling, but you don't know what that calling means. Are they nesting at that site, or are they flying over that site? And this graduate student is trying to figure out, is there a call that they give or something that indicates nesting that could help us in the acoustic monitoring? We also did some work on social attraction to see if murrelets would respond to recordings, and we found that they do. And in the year that we play the recordings in our control sites, we didn't play recordings, and in our other sites we did. And the number of detections went up in the year of playing those recordings. And then in the next year, we didn't play recordings in any of the sites, our control or our test sites. And we had an increase in the number of detections that we got. So that makes sense in terms of social attraction and seabirds. And so they seem to be responding to other murrelets to find out where the best habitat is.
Cool, thanks. Here's a good basic question that I don't think you mentioned. How big are they exactly?
Well, they're 9 inches in length. So that's about the length of an American robin, but their girth is big. And so we call them pigeon-sized. So if you think mourning dove, size, that's about, dove size is about the size they are. So they weigh 200 to 220 grams, which is similar to a mourning dove.
Okay, cool, thank you. There's another question about whether they can breed again after nest failure, and if they do that.
They do. It depends on when the nest fails. Through our marking work in Alaska and other folks' work in BC and in Washington, we all had birds re-nest after failure, but it has to happen early enough in the nesting season, because it takes about 2 weeks for the female to form an egg, and they have to copulate again and all of those sorts of things. So if there's enough time, they will. It's a small number. So of 200 plus birds that we captured on my work in Southeast Alaska, only 4 re-nested after failure.
Yeah, slow to increase their population. That's part of the trouble, huh?
Yeah.
Someone asked about population trends in Oregon versus Washington, and whether are there reasons why they're doing better in Oregon, if they're doing better in Oregon.
Well, yeah, the recent at-sea surveys. Now, we have to remember that they're at-sea counts, so they're counts of birds, and they're not really necessarily related to population trends, the population as a whole. So in terms of the counts, it shows murrelets declining significantly in Washington, fairly stable in Oregon, and increasing in California. If you look at breeding propensity and all of the work that's been done on nest success, there's no way they're increasing anywhere. But the survey data is showing that they are. So we're not exactly sure what's happening. These movements of the birds up and down the coast that I talked about could be affecting results in California, especially in the more recent years. So early on, they were declining everywhere, and it's just recently that they've stabilized in Oregon and are increasing in California. But these movements could be affecting those counts in some way. There could be other factors as well. So Washington seems to be declining because of habitat loss, but they haven't lost any more habitat than we have in Oregon. It might be something to do with Puget Sound and the difference in their prey there, and more human disturbance and those sorts of issues. So it's something that needs to be looked at. Is the outer coast of Washington and population doing better than that's in Puget Sound? And is there a difference in foraging that's impacting their nesting?
Interesting. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of creating large blocks of habitat, or why, like I've talked about, restoration, for example, what are the issues with opening up the canopy through things like thinning in plantations or other types of logging and any type of habitat?
Yeah, there's been research on their predators. So one of the things that we know that's happening, if you thin in a stand adjacent to a Murrelet occupied site, let's say you have a young forest next to an old growth forest and you thin in that young forest, it opens up the canopy, and depending on where it is, it allows a lot of berry producing bushes to grow, like salmonberry and elderberry. And the Steller's jays in particular love that, and they love the juxtaposition of those berry bushes with a forest where they can eat all the birds. So they're not eating just marbled murrelets, they're eating all the birds. And so it increases the jay populations because of that, opening up the canopy. It also allows ravens to forage better when they have openings to fly, because they don't like to fly through dense trees, but if they have openings, they can search for nests more easily. So, thinning has an impact on the predators, and that's having an impact on nesting success. Other things related to that are, remember, we've used the word solitary nesters to compare with colonial nesters, but murrelets are not solitary nesters. In other words, within a given stand, you have more than one pair. So larger is better because then you'd have room for more pairs to nest. And then you also need to remember that they don't use the same tree every year, but they come back to the same stand year after year. So I always say each murrelet has a home range, and within that home range, it alternates between nests, trees, between years to avoid predation. And so you need more than one nest tree for each pair, and you need a bunch of nest trees to have more murrelets in that stand. So larger is better.
Great, thank you. Have nesting platforms ever been tried, or is that a strategy for increasing nesting if there aren't big trees?
Yeah, there's discussion of that. I guess some timber companies tried earlier on, but we never saw any results from that. Certainly it's something that could be tried, especially with this social attraction, but it has to be done first in suitable unoccupied habitat. So if we had a stand that used to have murrelets and don't have murrelets now for some reason, and there are some on the Sayus law, we could go in and build some different kinds of platforms, because what are they gonna be attracted to if not a big branch? We'd have to design a bunch of different kind of nest platforms and then see which ones they like, and then you could expand from there to other types of habitat. But it has to be this sequential testing to look to see if it even works.
So just like many other things, saving the habitat and growing bigger trees is probably the best way of,
Yeah,
for sure. A natural solution as opposed to an engineered solution.
right.
Do you know what the current status of the recovery plan development is? I'm not sure if for just the state uplisting, or for I guess for federal land too.
Yeah, I guess that might be the state land question, because as far as I know, they're not updating the federal recovery plan for the murrelet. I don't know what the status is. I know ODF&W is working on it and ODF is working with them. Chandra, you may know more than me on that. I do not know the status or the timeline.
Okay, and I don't, but one of my colleagues might, so. Let's see. I thought I saw another one. Oh, someone asked whether they ever land on fresh water, like on rivers.
Not in rivers, although there have been a couple of chicks found in rivers, but those are ones that fell out of the nest and ended up in a river trying to make its way to the ocean. But they historically, marbled murrelets were found on lakes. And actually one of our marked birds that went to Washington landed briefly on Lake Ozette up in the Olympic Peninsula. So historically in British Columbia, especially, there are records of birds, murrelets being on the inland lakes, feeding on sockeye and other fish. In Oregon, Gabrielson and Jewett found a chick and what they thought were nests near D Lake, which is at Lincoln City. But now there's people there. And so I think it's a disturbance issue. I think they would use freshwater lakes in close proximity to the ocean more if there weren't people all around.
Actually, could you say a little bit more about disturbance? I know like in on the northern California coast and the redwoods, I remember going there and seeing signs about, for example, putting your garbage away because it attracts predators of marbled murrelets. But so that's one sort of disturbance, is people attracting predators. But what are the other impacts of people disturbance?
Well, there's very limited research, but for what we do know, it's not necessarily the sounds. So if you have a family hiking through murrelet habitat and with children and they're screaming, that's not going to affect the birds per se because they're way up in the tree. It's movement. So it's movement that they're going to see from 100 to 200 to 300 feet up in a tree that is going to scare them. And as an example, in Washington, there was a nest right on 101, and that bird did not mind all the cars going by, even though that's movement. But when two semi trucks passed each other at the same time, and it kind of created a vortex of air or something, the bird just immediately jumped off the nest right at that time. And so something about that movement and the wind affected them. We know, helicopters bother them, any kind of super loud sounds like blasting. But as far as that interaction between people being in murrelet stands, I think it's okay as long as they're not attracting the predators. And that's where it comes with food. There are a lot of campgrounds in old growth all along the Oregon coast, all the state parks in California and Washington. And that's really bad for murrelets because people leave the food out on the tables. They don't put their scraps away, and it brings in especially the Steller's jays, but also the ravens and crows. And in California, a study showed that Steller's jays were going from interior forests where their home range was, flying 5 or 10 miles to the campgrounds to eat murrelets. And it's because of all the food. They're attracted to the campground by the food. So in California, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, they've actually been shooting jays and ravens because they're trying to get the trash and garbage under control that are attracting the predators into murrelet habitat.
Wow, okay, yet another argument for cleaning up our trash, keeping a neat and keeping a neat camp. All right, maybe one more question. Someone commented about how the number of individual birds studied is relatively small, and if there's a concern that the results and recommendations might be skewed based on having a small sample. It's kind of
I think in each place there are small samples, but when you take it as a whole, there are over 500 murrelet nests known from Alaska down to Central California. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers published. So it depends on the question what you're interested in. If you want to know what they need, we know that in terms of the habitat they need, the trees they need, the fish they need, the conditions they need, we know all that. Things we don't know are, how big should a buffer be to buffer Murrelet habitat and prevent the predators from getting into an occupied site if you're going to thin next to it, those sorts of things. So there are tons and tons of questions still ask, but I think we have a lot of information about what these birds need and why they're declining.
All right, well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Kim. I think this is a super awesome information, and I think we all know there's still work to do to protect these really cool and unique birds.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chandra, and thanks everybody for joining. I hope some of you will come out to the coast in July and actually see some Murrelets.
Awesome. I will include the link for doing that in the blog post that goes up tomorrow with the video. So people can click on it and sign up if they want to go. All right. Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks everybody for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.